Today on the Roundhouse, we're talking with private rail car and locomotive owner Bennett Levin. All aboard!
In days past, the roundhouse was where the railroad worker united with the steam locomotive, each to prepare for the journey ahead. Today, it's where we examine the history, the industry, the machines, the hobby, and the passion behind railroading. News, interviews, stories, and more. So climb aboard. This is The Roundhouse.
Welcome to The Roundhouse. I'm your host, Nick Ozarek, and this is episode number 68 of our Trains and Railroading podcast, where we're talking about everything in the industry and the hobby. You name it, and we discuss it. We discuss it even when I'm recovering from a cold, hence the quality of my voice, so I apologize for that. But it is good to have you on board. Today we are talking to Bennett Levin. He is the owner of 3 private passenger rail cars, as well as 2 Pennsylvania Railroad E8s in their original paint scheme, which he has on frequent occasion taken to the main lines of the northeastern U.S. We get to hear about how he got into life-size toy trains, as he describes it. Follow him on some of the very interesting adventures that he's been on with his equipment, and see what the hometown connection is between his locomotives and my town. Yep, we'll get to find all that out. But again, guys, thank you for joining us here on the show. If you're new to the show, we have a lot of great content for you to explore on our website, theroundhousepodcast.com. Links to all sorts of fascinating stories there. This is a lot of fun for me to get to host, and I really appreciate your suggestions about who I should talk to and who I should bring onto the show. If you have some, be sure to contact us. I also quickly want to thank BCF Parts for a very generous donation to helping support the show. Thank you so much, BCF Parts. And if you listening to this really enjoy the show and what we're doing here, having that financial support means so much. Even if it's just a one-time donation, you could go to theroundhousepodcast.com, and it helps us out a great deal. Our guest today is a man who has a lot of passion for the railroads. He is the owner of the Juniata Terminal Railway facility in the Philadelphia region, but probably most well known as the owner and operator of 2 classic Pennsylvania Railroad E8s. Please welcome to the Roundhouse, Mr. Bennett Levin.
Good to be here.
So glad to have you on the show because you've done so much. Now, as I understand it, your career is originally from the architectural world. So how does that fit with your love of trains?
Well, I was actually in the engineering business. I was a graduate of Penn State, and I was in the engineering business, and I retired at an early age, and I decided to play with trains. The trains have always been a fixation with me since I was a child. At my grandmother's house in Jersey City, backed up to the Pennsylvania Railroad. And during the Second World War, being a youngster, all you could do is look out the back third floor window and watch the trains day and night bringing cargo into the port of New York. So it's like getting inoculated with a virus, but the thing is chronic and it's probably terminal.
Oh dear. Well, terrible maybe, but it's terribly exciting at the same time. And where most people who decide they want to play with trains just carve out a portion of their basement and set up their bench work, you've managed to have several ways to play with the real things. First, I suppose it's worth looking at the Juniata Terminal Railway facility. What is that operation about?
Well, before you get to that, you have to remember the old fable of, for the one to nail, the shoe is lost, and for the one to shoe, the horse was lost. And they finally lost the war, the battle in the country. What had happened is my son Eric and I decided to buy the Pennsylvania office car 120, and then we needed to have a place to rebuild it, and we needed a place to store it, and then we needed a locomotive to move it around. And then my son went to work for the railroad, and then one day the Norfolk Southern and the CSX were selling off Conrail executive engines. So we ventured out first to the Norfolk Southern auction in Altoona. We were the last person standing with a checkbook, and we acquired the 5809. And we restored it. And then the CSX auctioned off their two engines, and we purchased both of those engines. One was an Erie engine, which we sold to a gentleman that had the same virus that I had, except he was an Erie virus rather than a Pennsylvania virus. And then when we had these locomotives, I ran a trip, and I said, oh my God, I said, I really need a car that had greater ability for hospitality. So we bought a Southern Pacific French Quarter lounge car, and we restored it at our facility in Philadelphia. That became the Warrior Ridge. Then one day we found out, my God, the Warrior Ridge really didn't have a vestibule, so it's not really safe. So we then bought another Southern Pacific sleeper, and we restored that into the little Juniata Rapids. It was a 10-6 sleeper, because that had a vestibule. We run that next to the Warrior Ridge when there is no further access available. So that's how we got to what is called now the Fleet of Memories.
The Fleet of Memories. I think that's a very classy name. All right, so following your chronological order then, let's start with the 120, the observation car, which has a very fascinating history to that. How did you come into possession of it?
Well, the history is that it was in its last role with Pennsylvania. It was the car that was assigned to the president of the railroad. At that time, it was Walter Franklin. And then from Walter Franklin, the car was actually rebuilt at Altoona in the 50s for Walter Franklin when he succeeded Martin Clement as president of the railroad. Then it was used by Jim Sims after him, and it was the car that carried Robert Kennedy's body from New York to Washington after he was assassinated. It also carried President Kennedy from several Army-Navy games in Philadelphia. He would fly up by helicopter, but then the family would go home by train. So the car has a pretty interesting history, especially in the fact that this coming spring will be the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Robert Kennedy.
Really fascinating history to have that much connection to a car. And then, was that sold at an auction then? And around what time frame did you...
No, that car was bought at auction, I believe, by a gentleman by the name of George Pins. George Pins was probably the mover and the shaker of the present-day reincarnation of private car travel and the operation of private cars on Amtrak. And George Pins bought the car, and regrettably, during his ownership, there was an incident in New York's Penn Station where somebody who was inebriated climbed up on the roof of the car and hit the catenary and was severely burned. And Mrs. Pins said, that's enough of this hobby. And George sold the car to a gentleman in St. Petersburg whose father was the general manager of the Pennsylvania Railroad at one time in Pittsburgh, a gentleman by the name of Smith. And then Smith sold the car. He was a Oldsmobile dealer in St. Petersburg, and he sold the car to a gentleman by the name of Mitchell in New Orleans who really didn't know what to do with it. And he put an advertisement in Trains magazine, and we bought the car from Mr. Mitchell in New Orleans.
Now, as it had been making the rounds, what condition was it in? Did you have to do any extensive restoration work to it?
When we bought the car, we brought it back to Philadelphia, and then we took it to Pottstown, Pennsylvania, to the old Bethlehem Steel fabricating plant, and we had rented space up there. And basically, we rebuilt the car. We took off the bad metal, we rebuilt the entire black platform, we rewired the car completely, we plumbed the car completely, took out all the steam heat. We made it an electric heat car so it was compatible with Amtrak. We rebuilt the trucks. We put new wheels, the new brake system, and the car, while it appears the same on the outside, was totally rebuilt mechanically. And then we took the car to a custom boat builder, Panama City, Florida, and he replaced the bilious, I call it tall, funky yellow woodwork, was a Raymond Loewy pick and put in there in the 1950s when Franklin had the car, and we replaced it all with walnut interiors on the inside. So the configuration of the car is the same, but the car has been totally rebuilt. For instance, there used to be a Presta-Lite log stove because you can't take propane into the tunnels in New York. Well, the stove was ripped out, but it was replaced by a stove that looks like what was there originally, but it's an electric stove now. So, we made the car compatible to operate at 110 miles an hour on Amtrak, but at the same time, we kept the historical appearance of the car as it was when the Pennsylvania Railroad owned it.
You do this extensive restoration work, you take it onto the road, and now you need a place to put it.
Yeah, I needed a place, I needed a garage. And we were lucky enough that we found a building in Philadelphia that the Pennsylvania Railroad had built in 1928 as a less than carload transfer facility. They had 2 overhead cranes, 3 indoor tracks, and they would bring the flat cars in there, and they put these 8-foot LCL containers on the flat cars. And they had facilities like this in most major cities in the East where they served. In NOLA, in Harrisburg, there was this large crane structure that must have stretched a quarter of a mile or so. And at night, trains from Baltimore and New York and Jersey City, with Philadelphia would all converge, and then the train would leave from Nola and head west, to Detroit, to Pittsburgh, to Columbus, Indianapolis, or Chicago, or St. Louis. And of course, earlier in the morning, the eastbound trains with containers would repeat the transfer in Enola, and then the trains would continue east. So this was a rather large structure with 50,000 square foot clear span with 2 overhead cranes and 3 little indoor tracks, a large loading platform. It was along the main line in Philadelphia, which was a switch to 30th Street. And at that time, when we bought it from Conrail, and they were very accommodating with us. They granted us all kinds of rights to move the car and have Amtrak come on to a Conrail package to move our cars to and from the 30th Street between the facility and 30th Street. So we have this entire building that houses basically the units and 3 cars. And then we have a fleet of SW1500 and MP15AC switchers that we've rebuilt and we resell, that they're also stored and maintained in that building in Philadelphia.
With the SW1500s and the MP15s, those are locomotives that you lease out to other short lines then?
Well, right now there's one of these locomotives leased out to Bombardier for the light rail line between Camden and Trenton, where they use it for ballast work and maintenance. And in the early morning in the fall, they run a train that sprays the track with chemicals to overcome the oil left by crushed leaves on the tracks, because the diesel M units do not have sanders. They would slide a quarter of a mile past the station otherwise. So we've leased locomotives to industrial users such as General Electric, and we lease it now to the Bombardier over in Camden, and we have a fleet of 3 switch engines. We had 4. We sold one to a quarry recently, and we have a slug also. By the way, MTH is bringing out this month a model of one of our SW1500s in O-gauge.
That'll be nice to see come out, although I have to say, if they didn't record your voice for their little conversations that they have inside the engine, they missed a fine opportunity.
But it might have come out X-rated, okay?
Well, then maybe not. Though it would make it a unique product. So you have the car, you have the garage, but now you take it in a direction that most of your private car owning colleagues probably wouldn't go, and that is to own their own locomotives. How did you initially find out that the E-units were going up for sale?
My son worked for Conrail, and he was the one that motivated me to buy the locomotives, okay? And Eric, said, this is an opportunity to get something that's a once in a lifetime will come on the market. So we went up to Altoona on a hot 90-degree day. And like I said earlier, we were the last people standing at the auction. And we brought the locomotive back to I think that time was Norfolk Southern number 1000. We brought that back to Philadelphia, and we basically rebuilt the engine. We probably replaced most of the sheet metal on the nose, the side panels. We put the battens back. We put the antennas back on the roof. And if you go to the PRR website, there should be a complete chronological photo history of how the locomotives were restored.
I'll place a link to that in the show notes. What's interesting is that obviously Conrail had some level of nostalgia. The upper management had some level of nostalgia for these locomotives, having them in office car service. CSX and NS, they get these assets, and for one reason or another, they decide that it's not worth the effort and work to restore these.
Not really. The interesting thing is, surely if we bought the engines and restored them, there was a change of management at Norfolk Southern. And Wick Morman became the CEO and the president. And there is a eclectic railroad affinity organization called the Lexington Group, which are railroad professionals and academicians and writers, very much beneath the radar, and they meet once a year. Well, the meeting that year was Harrisburg. They prevailed upon me to organize a trip with Norfolk Southern, and we did a trip from Harrisburg to Altoona, around the curve from UN to AR, back into Altoona for lunch, and then we went up the Bald Eagle, and then back down the Susquehanna to Harrisburg. And on that trip, Wick Morman had just become the CEO of Norfolk Southern, and he said to me, I have to have a pair of these. He says, can I get up in the engines? I said, sure. So go up in the engine. And that's how NS decided that they needed a pair of covered wagons, and they bought that, I guess just 4 of them, that they restored and they use on their office car specials. So as management changes, there's a different perspective on the value of an office car special and the value of using a heritage-type locomotive on it. Now, I can tell you that there is an enormous amount of nostalgia attached to this. So one of the early trips that we ran with the locomotives for the Harrisburg chapter of the NRHS, we went to Renovo, and I was standing on the ground, and an older gentleman comes up to me, and he had tears in his eyes. And he says, my God, he said, I work for the railroad. He said, I never thought I'd ever see these things again. He says, God bless you. Well, that buys a lot of diesel fuel, just to know that people really appreciate seeing it, and people that have worked for the railroad have an appreciation of what it takes to maintain these things and operate them.
And it is a lot of work. You really do it for the love of what it is. Yes, when you restore a private car, you can send it out on charter service, and that allows you to gain some revenue, but I imagine most of that, if not all of that, just goes back into keeping the cars operational. And in your case, additionally, your locomotives.
I would have been better off with 3 mistresses, okay?
Well, rail fans would highly disagree. They would not have nearly the interest in taking photos of your 3 mistresses as they would in taking photos of your locomotives.
Well, You might be stretching the point, okay?
I probably am. But that's okay, because honestly, they are such a sight to see.
Well, it's nice to see them out along the railroad when you're running, because they do get pleasure out of it. But what's even nicer is when they bring your young kids out to see them while they're taking pictures, and the kids can experience something from the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. That's 50 years ago. That's 60 years ago, and it's generational. So, we get a big kick when we see the youngsters looking at the locomotives, and it's just part of one of the benefits that you get from doing all this.
Part of it is that it's not just the age of the locomotives. It's also the fact that you take them to places on lines that haven't seen a passenger train for decades. You've done a lot of rare mileage trips with them. And I'm curious, of some of those off the beaten path trips you've done, what are some of your favorites?
I like them all because that's part of the adventure of it. But we took them to Chicago for National Train Day several years ago. And we went from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh one day, and we overnighted in Pittsburgh, and then we went out to Chicago and came back on Mother's Day. Well, I could tell you that the crowds along the railroad in Ohio and Indiana on Mother's Day were absolutely astounded. People were just out there waiting to see. We had the 3 cars and the 2 E-units. And the photographs that people posted on the internet, I just got such a terrific kick out of it. But, we went down from Pittsburgh down into West Virginia. I ran a trip a couple of years ago called The Coal Goes to War. And we went down on the Mon line to the coal country in West Virginia. But, the trips up the Bald Eagle, we did a trip to Erie before they abandoned that line from up along, from Driftwood and Emporium and over to Erie. And then shortly after that, the line was removed. So to get on some of these older pieces of railroad is a real treat, because you go through these little towns that are just the way they were in the 1950s. Very little change, and the people come out and they just get a big kick out of it.
The one that I can easily cite as my personal favorite, and it's not even a close competition, is when in August of 2011, you partnered with High Iron Travel and you ran a private car trip along the old Erie Main Line going through southern New York. And then you came across to so through towns like Olean and Jamestown, New York. And then you come into northwestern Pennsylvania. And here's the important detail. You come to my hometown of Meadville.
Are you from Meadville?
I am from Meadville.
I think we overnighted in Meadville.
Yes, you did. You overnighted in Meadville in the yard.
And then we went to Oil City, and then we backed up to Meadville, and then went into Youngstown, and from there into Pittsburgh.
Yep. And there were a few aspects of pride. One being just to see those engines and to see passenger train in my hometown. The last excursions we had were in the late 90s, so seeing that was beyond incredible. But also the fact that despite the fact that the Western New York and Pennsylvania, which is one of the railroads you traveled across, they have Alcos, which are a rail fan favorite. We're not a hot spot for rail fans. So you come in with your train, there's 50 cars of rail fans, and there's a certain sense of pride of, oh, you're coming to my hometown now. And that has its own specialness to it. That, and you pulled into Cambridge Springs and the fire department was there and a lot of the members of the town were there. I mean, there is a sense of something important has come to town. And I think that means a lot to people, not just rail fans.
In Cambridge Springs, we went to that famous hotel. We all had dinner. I mean, it was just terrific. I mean, that was a very, very special trip. We left Hoboken early in the morning. And, you go over really railroads that were almost abandoned, okay? We go up to Binghamton and we just continue across the southern tier. And we wound up in Lakeville? Was it Lakeville? I'm trying to think, north of Elmira, north of Corning on a piece of short line. And then we went back down. We got on to western New York, Pennsylvania, and we went through Olean and wound up in Beeville. And what's nice is all the people on these short line railroads really go out of the way to show you the hospitality. They're all cooperative. They all think it's terrific. And what we did is we left some charitable donations along the way to support some local charities. Early on, we ran a trip to Clearfield with R.J. Corman, and we raised $50,000 in the community, and were able to give every school child in the county an opportunity to ride a train. We left cars there for a week. Whether they were in parochial school or private school or public school or special education, R.J. Corman, when we left the cars there, were able to give each of these school kids a ride on a train. There's great social benefits and benefits for public relations for the industry by doing all this.
Beyond a shadow of a doubt, I think one of the most touching stories that I came across was that of your work to put together the Liberty Limited. And I'd love to hear you share that here, because I think that is just an incredible story of how many moving pieces you were able to put together for that.
Well, that's an interest. That was really all my wife's idea. We were driving to California, and we were in the West Texas desert, and we were listening to Tony Snow on the radio, and he was talking about the Wounded Warrior Project. And my wife says, my God, we got to do something. So by the time we got to California, this is 2005, I said, well, maybe we'll run a train and take the wounded from Walter Reed and Bethesda to the Army-Navy game. And I had no idea whether you could do it or you couldn't do it. And I got a hold of David Gunn, who was president of Amtrak. I said, what do you think? And David Gunn and Joe McHugh, the vice president of government affairs, said to me, absolutely, we'll be in with you to do this. And at that time, I was the trustee of the Army War College Foundation in Carlisle. And I made arrangements through the foundation and the Pentagon to meet the general that was in charge of Walter Reed. And we went down, my wife and I went down and met him, I guess, in March 2005, and we made a proposal to him to take 100 wounded to the game. And we had no idea, absolutely had no idea if we could do it. He said, fine. We said, right, there's only one set of rules that if we do this, we want no politicians on the train, we want nobody from the media, no press, and nobody from the Pentagon. And the general agreed with it. And then we went to work. We put together 18 private cars, and we raised the money to buy the tickets. It cost us $16,500 to buy tickets for the War Memorial the game, and the Association of American Railroads contributed, and we had private people contributed. Woolwich up in Woolwich, Pennsylvania, donated stadium blankets for the soldiers, and each soldier or sailor or Marine could bring a father or a mother, or they bring their girlfriend, their wife, their husband, their boyfriend, whatever it happens to be. They all could bring a guest. And Walmart gave us digital cameras, and Bushnell gave us binoculars, and Gear gave us embroidered jackets, and we put together one hell of a trip for 100 wounded military. And we got them tickets on the 50-yard line, and they all had dinner in a dining room in an office car with china and linen and glassware, choice of entrees. They got a real first-class experience. And it's been the gift that for us goes on giving, because my wife and I, even though we said no publicity, it made its way to the internet. And this every year about this time, it hits the internet again and goes around. And we've been blessed to have been honored for doing it. But the biggest pleasure we have gotten was being able to bring some joy into these people that have sacrificed so much for our country, and whose service has really gone unappreciated by most of our citizens who just don't care. It's a real crying shame.
I think what was good about the story getting out there is obviously you weren't doing this for the glory or recognition. You were doing this because you wanted to give them a good time. But I think it highlights the need for the average citizen not just to remember the service and sacrifice that these brave men and women have performed, but also that they still have lives ahead of them and they still have experiences they want to have. And especially for some of the hospital's patients who maybe they aren't able to get out as much because of whatever medical conditions they might have, for them to be able to travel by train and feel appreciated like that, that's just immensely important.
The interesting thing is I was in a hobby shop in Pasadena, the Whistle Stop Hobby Shop. Fred Hill's the owner, and this was like a year ago, and he came up to me and he says, I have two customers who rode the Liberty Limited. And he said both of them were never model railroaders, but from that experience, they became model railroaders. And the interesting thing is that Jim Rinn from Trains magazine, the people at Comeback, had given me a collection of magazines, Trains, Classic Trains, Model Railroader, and Classic Toy Trains to put on each car. So these soldiers or Marines, whatever they happen to be, must have taken the magazines, and they became model railroaders. So it gives you a sense of satisfaction that you've added something dimensionally to the lives of those who have really sacrificed so much for the freedoms that we enjoy.
Absolutely true. Now, those trips you didn't want politicians on board, but at that same time, you did offer a couple of trips that were specifically for politicians, members of local and state government, to try to convince them of the importance and significance of passenger rail travel, especially here in the state of Pennsylvania. So what gave you the idea to host those, and how successful do you think they were ultimately?
Well, John Taylor, who is the chairman of the House Transportation Committee here in Pennsylvania, happens to be an old friend of mine from my days after I had retired and I was the L&I commissioner in the city of Philadelphia. And his chief, head of the research for the Transportation Committee, a gentleman by the name of Everett Bugal, that I've known for many years, and they contacted me, and there was a lot of pressure, a lot of lobbying going on for a second frequency to the Pennsylvania schedule. And we had dinner in Harrisburg one night, and I said, well, why don't I just put a couple cars on the back of the Pennsylvania, and we'll take the entire committee to Pittsburgh to show them what Amtrak is from Philadelphia to Harrisburg, and what Norfolk Southern is from Harrisburg to Pittsburgh, and they can see actually what the Pennsylvania is, trains 42 and 43, and they could walk through the coaches, and they could talk to the customers since the state basically funds those trains. So we did it in 2015. It was really a pretty nice experience. And then we allowed a railroad advocacy group, the Downtown Pittsburgh Partnership, to board the train, I guess, in Greensburg or in Latrobe to lobby the members of the House Transportation Committee directly for the second frequency. Well, in 2016, the committee decided to hold a public hearing in Pittsburgh on the matter of the additional frequency, funding an additional train across the state. And Taylor and Bugal called me again. They said, can we do the trip again? I said, sure. So we did it again in 2016. And we broke it up. We went to Carnegie Mellon, and we saw the driverless car laboratory, and we took in a baseball game, and we had a nice dinner. And then they said after last year's election, they had new members on the committee, can we do it again? So we did it a third time. But as a result of that, the state legislature voted to fund a new study about additional frequency between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. There had been a previous study done, but the study showed going to State College, you had to take a bus for the last 13 miles, There was a study that was designed to fail. So now there's a study underway in a more pragmatic manner to add a second frequency, because the time schedule of the Pennsylvania now runs as an extension of the Capital Limited, and it is really not conducive for many people to use to get between places on the train across the state, because it leaves very early in the morning from Pittsburgh and gets to Pittsburgh very late at night. We used to take that train frequently from Philadelphia to go to a night ball game in Pittsburgh. When the All-Star game was in Pittsburgh, we went out and went to the All-Star game. You can't do that now. You get to Pittsburgh too late. The schedule is not a convenient schedule, but the schedule is arranged around the Capital Limited because the state has to pay less that way, because the formula is different when it's an extension of an existing long-distance train. So hopefully the new study will find some basis to justify a rationalization of the schedule and a second frequency between Harrisburg and Pittsburgh.
It's good to shore up the future of the existing Pennsylvanian service as well, because there's been times when you'll see in the news PennDOT sharing concerns about how long can we keep financing even just one train per day per direction. And there's a lot of articles out there that do a pretty good job of interviewing the passengers and showing how vital this connection is. And certainly improving the frequency is a fantastic goal, but even just to make sure the thing continues to run, because we see stories nationally about Amtrak routes that are under threat of being cut. And so many people rely on those. Whatever tools can be used to convince the right people that know these things matter need to be used.
The key to Amtrak's future success off of the Carter is going to be partnerships with the states. And you have many states now that kick in. You have New York, you have Pennsylvania, you have Maine, you have Virginia, you have North Carolina, you have Illinois, you have Indiana, you have California. There are many states that have put their money where their mouth is. But regrettably, the people in the state legislature don't really understand railroads and railroading. You know, it's when you go and you can show the elected representatives from the east part of Pennsylvania the investment that Norfolk Southern has in Altoona and what that means in jobs, and taxes, and revenue, that there's a better appreciation that this is just not running one train across the state. This is part of a larger economic engine that has many, many benefits to the Commonwealth. And on the last trip, I prepared a 64-page route guide, and it discusses all those issues. But not only did it discuss those issues, it discussed the history of railroads in Pennsylvania, because Pennsylvania has a rich, rich history. Not only the Pennsylvania Railroad, but the Delaware and Hudson was the first common carrier. And the Reading at one time was the largest capitalized corporation in the world. I mean, you have all this fantastic history, and when the people in the legislature see the bigger picture, have a better appreciation of the history, then it's a lot easier to pry the money out of them to support the train service, because they seem to have money for a lot of nonsense. And if you can make the train service appear to be more of an essential item that has an appreciation by the voters, then it's a lot easier to make the argument that you must support the train number one, and you must support a second frequency, because the second frequency complements the first frequency, because you could be able to travel so far and return in the same day, where now it's really not that easy to do, especially heading west.
It is highly important to acknowledge that history, and everybody finds different pieces of history to attach to. One event that you were involved in, as were your locomotives, that certainly celebrated a great deal of national passenger rail history was the Streamliners at Spencer event in 2014. And it's a testament to the fact that so many different railroads and organizations and locomotive owners were able, such as yourself, to come together to make that event happen in North Carolina.
Well, that was all an outgrowth of the love for the industry that Wick Moorman had. Wick Moorman understood the value of public relations and the value that every rail fan is a potential advocate, especially when the railroad is advocating for public-private partnerships, for improvements to their right-of-way, like Norfolk Southern was doing on the Preston Carter. It was a natural public relations machine. And he was genius enough to say, well, if we can draw all this attention, in North Carolina, it has a basic political benefit. But with regard to Streamliners at Spencer, we also took one of the E units and the cars, and we ran a round trip from Charlotte to Spencer and back during that festival as a fundraiser to benefit North Carolina Transportation Museum. So the museum picked up a couple of bucks due to the generosity of Wick Moorman in allowing us to run from the Charlotte airport, from the intermodal terminal to Charlotte airport, up to Spencer and back.
Because Wick, initially retired from Norfolk Southern and then was brought out of retirement to be the CEO of Amtrak, and now Norfolk Southern is being run by Jim Squires. What does that mean for you as far as your opportunities to be able to bring your toy train, so to speak, onto their railroad for future excursions?
It's not a problem at all because we've behaved ourselves. We keep our guests in order. We don't tolerate nonsense, and we're viewed as responsible people, and we continue to be welcomed by Norfolk Southern.
That's excellent to hear. So do you have another Liberty Limited planned for this year, 2017, or any other rare mileage trips coming up?
No, we are blessed with the fact that our nation's, the price we pay for our peacekeeping efforts and the war on terrorism have shown a marked decrease in the population of the hospital, and I can't even tow a train any longer, so you can't run one. We don't have, thank God, the number of wounded that we used to have, so that there's really not the need to do it. And that's a blessing in itself.
When you look at everything you've managed to accomplish because of these pieces of history that you own and the opportunities you've had to take them out on the road, what are you most thankful about?
Well, I'm thankful that I have a son that I share the hobby with, okay? I'm thankful that I have a wife that doesn't view it as the iron mistress and allows me the ability to run the trains. And I'm thankful that the railroad allow us the access. And I'm thankful that basically I can live out what was a passion from when I was a child, and continue through my life. And at this point in my life, I'm 78 years old. And here I am, and I can do these things. I think that is a blessing that the Lord has given me the years, and He's given me a few bucks that I could spend on this stuff. And I have a son who is very passionate about it, who's made a career on the railroad. And without my son, I really couldn't do it because he's the one who's the hands-on person.
It's tremendous that this is a family affair for you and that you get to have all hands on deck to pull off these incredible events, trips, excursions, and bring such great memories to people. Bennett, thank you so much for joining us here on the Roundhouse today and sharing just a piece of your experience with a great, important ambassador for Pennsylvania Railroad fans around the globe. So thank you so much.
Okay, and good evening to you, and thank you for inviting me. Thank you very much.
And now, the question of the day.
Last time on the Roundhouse, we were talking to Rick Rowlands, who is the founder of Youngstown Steel Heritage, which is developing an entire museum dedicated to the history of steel manufacturing on a 1.2 acre plot of land. Very unique challenge to have to fit so much into such a small space. So the question that I posed to you guys was, if you only had a small amount of land, what museum would you create? John Hillier writes, a museum that served discontinued items from fast food restaurants. And I would never offer Wi-Fi. I would call it the Museum of Yummy Amusements, and I would hire an Alanis Morissette tribute band, Atlantis Morrissey, to play in the beer garden that only served Schlitz and Michelob. Wow, John, you have put a lot of thought into that question. So kudos to you on that. And then this from Jeffrey Gray. I would love to have a G-scale railroad museum on my little plot of land someday. I'd get all kinds of rolling stock and locomotives to run on tracks, crisscrossing and looping on my bit of land. Also very creative use. And kudos to Sam Livingston, who asked me what I would do with such a small plot of land, what museum I would create. And Sam, thanks for being the first person to ask me what I would do with my own question of the day. That's a good question. And, well, I'm congratulating myself on the question. But the answer is I would probably develop some kind of logging museum. I've always had a fascination with logging equipment, especially those geared locomotives. I'm not too far from where the Climax locomotives were built, so I have a soft spot in my heart for them. That's probably what I would do. Your question of the day for this episode is, what diesels would be leading your private cars? Diesels only, folks. No steam this week. What diesels would you have leading your private train? Let me know on the roundhousepodcast.com. Links to social media are there. And if you want to help support the show, we gladly accept your donations. $1 goes a long way to helping cover our web costs, as well as being able to do really cool things in the future, especially when it comes to your requests. Thank you guys for listening. Remember, as always, that the Roundhouse is our house.